mission statement is to protect human health and the environment. So our programs address how people interact with the environment. So we think about drinking water. We think about our sewage systems and how water ends up in our rivers and streams and the oceans. But we also think about the environment itself. So we look at ecosystems like wetlands that are really important for cleaning the water. We look at the air, the health of our air, which of course we breathe, but also we're not the only ones who breathe the air. So that is a pretty broad scope for our agency. When it comes to renewable energy, it's important to think about the difference between EPA and the Department of Energy, right? So the Department of Energy's mission is to actually develop, and they have a tremendous research arm. And in particular, they have the National Renewable Energy Lab, which, have you heard of this?
I heard of renewable energy.
Okay, so the acronym is NREL, and the National Renewable Energy Lab is part of the Department of Energy, and a great resource for you to find information about the latest on. They grow solar crystals and slice silicone in different ways and do research about that kind of stuff to make those renewable energy technologies better and better. At EPA, we promote renewable energy because of the benefits, because it protects human health and the environment. So when we think about renewable energy, we're not so much focused on the research and development of the technology, but we're thinking about the deployment, how people use it and if they can access it, whether or not they can afford it or if it makes sense. And so we think a lot about the policies and the incentives. So I'm wondering if that's something that you want to talk more about. So if it is, I can give you more information. Policies.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the key question. Okay. So you're familiar with the different types of renewable energy, and some of them are tried and true. In fact, wind power, for example, is very popular, right? Do you know where windmills were invented?
England?
Older than that?
Older?
Yeah. I'll give you a hint. It's in the Middle East. In fact, they were invented in Iran, and they're over 1,000 years old. It's a very old technology. It was used to grind grain. It was also used widely in China, and that would be to pump water into the rice paddies. Again, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It wasn't until after the Middle Ages and the Crusades that wind power actually moved to Europe, where we think of it now, and it's used for grinding grain, pumping water, and of course now we use it for power. But it's a very old technology. Same with hydropower. Dams have been built, not quite as old as wind power, but still very old source of power, because water turns a wheel, and that kind of water mill power has been kind of the earliest engine of industry. Solar power is a little bit newer. It depends on how you define it. Some people say the earth is powered by solar power because plants use solar energy. We eat plants, right? So that you can make that argument if you wanted. But the modern solar panel is a pretty interesting and innovative technology that now we're harnessing to produce power on a very local level. It's kind of amazing that we can put a panel about the size of this table on our roof and make power, if you think about it. But that's kind of the beauty of technology. So these different technologies have different uses, and that's really important when it comes to devising the policy around them. For example, there's something that's very important to people who manage electricity grids, and that's the fact that when you produce power at a power plant and you transmit it over the power lines, there's something called resistance on the lines, and it reduces the amount of power that actually arrives to your home tremendously. You actually I think you lose over half of the power on the way. So it's a lot of extra work that you're having to, a lot of extra coal to burn, a lot of extra gas to burn, because you lose it just when it's traveling on the wires. So where the power is produced is actually really important, and this is one of the benefits that people think alternative energy has, which is probably don't want to site a new power plant in your front yard, but you might be able to put up a solar panel, and that's not going to harm your quality of life. So therefore, the energy that you produce on your roof is what we call delivered power, and it's worth more. It's worth a lot more. It's like a retail rate instead of a wholesale rate. That's the way the power companies think about it. And another name they use for it is distributed generation. So the concept is if we distribute our power plants, our sources of generation, all around the places where we actually use it, then we don't have to produce as much, and it's worth more where it's produced. We don't lose it along the way. So solar energy has that tremendous advantage of being neighborhood safe, very, very appropriate for the point of use. Windmills maybe are a step down from that. You wouldn't necessarily put a windmill in your front yard, but you might. Depends on where you live. And it depends on what your neighbors think about putting up windmills in your yard and how much wind you have too. So a rule of thumb with windmills is you want to have your turbine poking above everything around it, because anything around it's blocking the wind, right? So it needs to stick up by nature. It needs to be out there on display to get the wind. And so windmills have been used in some urban settings, and there's some great examples in London, in fact, that are interesting. In the middle of parking lots, there's some windmills that the city has supported. They also can be put underwater. And I don't know if this is one of your topics, but tidal turbines is the same kind of mechanization of a windmill, but it's underwater. And of course, as you know, as a New Yorker, the tide comes in, the tide comes out. It's pretty reliable. It's actually way more reliable than even the wind. So that's another interesting and potentially urban or distributed sort of generation source that we can harness. And then hydro, you pretty much got to follow the water, right? So you can't just move a river. So that's probably not something that we would consider distributed generation. And in many cases, hydropower has already been identified. We knew about Niagara Falls. We know about the big rivers. These are not the big surprises for us right now. So a lot of states, such as New York, which sources a good amount of our power from hydro, and it's upstate hydropower. Also Washington, the state of Washington and Oregon, have a huge river called the Columbia. It comes out of the Columbia River Gorge, and on a good year, they get a huge amount of power from the river. On a bad year, if there's a drought, they've got to find other sources. They've got to buy power from out of state and other places. So there's an interesting sort of decision-making process for the people who supply our grids about where your power comes from, right? And so they think about reliability, location, cost, and cost, right? So I'd like to talk to you about a couple cool websites that I think you may have seen, but if not, I'd like to highlight for you. One of them is EPA's Power Profiler, which allows you to put in your zip code. And you type in your zip code onto the website, and it shows you a little pie chart of where your energy comes from. So it's a great way for you to see what energy is associated, what type of power plant or power generation source is associated with you turning on your light switch. And it's very interesting. You can type in, say, your grandmother's zip code, or somebody you know in another state, and see what kind of difference are in the what they call the power profile of your electricity. Another great website that I love to tell people about is called Desire. It's D-no-E, D-S-I-R-E. And it's the database of state incentives for renewable energy. And so a lot of renewable energy is tied very closely to the policy incentives that have been created to offset the costs of them. Most renewable energy sources have a higher cost associated with them. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but but you might say that these incentives kind of offset the higher costs and make it more feasible for, say, you, the homeowner, to put solar panels on your house, or you, the sewage treatment plant, to put up a wind turbine next to your settling ponds on your grounds.